Well, thank you, Michael, for that generous and embarrassing introduction. Thank you, Dan and Helen, for making this lecture series possible and for everything you've done for American University. Thank you, Max. It's been a pleasure meeting you. And thank you, as always, to Laura for making everything happen in the Israel Studies program at American University. I'm very honored to be invited to speak. And what I'm going to try to do now, hopefully the technology will work, is share my screen and share my sound. I'm writing a little book now called Zionism and Emotional State. I'm trying to examine the history of Zionism through the lens of emotions, which are no less a powerful force in human history than ideas or institutions. And I'm bringing to this particular subject an interest in Jewish history in general, and for tonight at least American Jewish history in particular, around a fact and some puzzles. The fact is about the extraordinary role American Jews played in helping with the establishment of Israel in 1948. And they donated to the United Jewish Appeal about $150 million, which was quite a bit more than they had raised, or the UJ had raised previously. It's about $1.5 billion in today's money, which is quite a bit. And just to show you how important that sum was, it was 4 times greater than the entire United Way campaign for that year for the entire United States. The Jewish community of the United States at the time was about just under 5 million. So we have puzzles. The one puzzle is, why were American Jews so generous? What did the establishment of Israel in 1948 mean to them? And what was the balance of emotions at work behind their actions? A more complicated question that's come up a lot in my work on the history of Zionism as a whole is, were Jews who did support Israel, who gave money, who gave of their time, were they the objects of emotional manipulation? Were there figures in the Zionist leadership or the Israeli government who were tailoring propaganda or appealing to the heartstrings? If people were being manipulated, who was doing that? And if not, how were emotional messages communicated and reinforced? I won't hide my own feelings going into this, that I think that concepts of manipulation can be quite crude and stereotyped, and that there is such a thing as emotional guidance, where people do receive emotional messages, but unless those messages reach somewhere in our hearts and respond to our own deeply held values, we're not going to listen. So I think the concept of manipulation has to be quite nuanced, and I hope I can do that this evening. I'm very interested in the general field of the history of emotions, which has been really thriving now for some decades. One term that I've been using a bit is the term feeling rules, which are the emotional norms that we all live by. It could be our profession, it could be class or even racially related. The notion of how people in our particular community are allowed or not allowed to express emotion. Another term that will show up a lot in my talk tonight is emotional regime. This is a term coined in the late 90s by Bill Reddy to refer really to political regimes that impose a certain kind of emotional order, again, a norm of what's permitted and what's not. I'm also interested in more amorphous kinds of emotions, emotional groups or emotional communities. Maybe you don't have a state authority directing what people feel, but people feel things anyway, and they communicate with each other informally, and they create what Barbara Rosenwein has called an emotional community. So that's a concept that I use a lot. And last but not least, there's been some very interesting work on social movements and how social movements are amorphous. You can't really count who's in them. And yet there are very powerful emotional messages that spread through the movements and give them vitality. What's missing in the literature so far is how emotional norm formation exists among ethno-national communities, ethnic groups. It's interesting that this has actually not been studied a whole lot. And I also find that although there's an enormous literature on national identities or nationalisms, most scholars who work on emotion and nationalism work on negative emotions like hatred or rage or frustration, and they forget that nationalism is also very much, or can very much be, inspired by and can inspire emotions such as compassion, solidarity, love, sacrifice. And I want to be able to balance out the two. I think there's been a bit of a imbalance in the way we look at American Zionism in the 1930s, 40s, In the literature to date, it tends to focus on elites, particularly these two gentlemen, Stephen S. Wise and Abba Hillel Silver, their own leadership in the Zionist movement in the United States, their relationship with their lobbying with the administration of Harry S. Truman on behalf of the partition of Palestine, the recognition of Israel, and so on. It's very important. But what I want to do tonight is look at something a little different. I want to look at a secondary elite of fundraisers, lay activists, rabbis, educators, and journalists, people who wrote for the Jewish press, who were sort of public figures. Now, obviously, even that elite is still a small group, and I cannot get inside the hearts of millions of American Jews and tell you why they did what they did, but they leave behind traces, and I hope to examine some of those traces this evening. I want to start by going back a little bit in time. The notion of an American Jewish emotional community bound by solidarity and compassion with Jews in the old country is something that is deep-seated. We see it after World War I, when Jews had suffered terribly, and after World War I in Eastern Europe, persecution, pogroms, poverty. And in 1926, the United Jewish Campaign, which raised money on behalf of Eastern European Jews, clearly had a number of emotional messages. And we're going to see quite a bit of continuity between the emotional messages in these non-Zionist, really Eastern Europe-oriented philanthropies and 1948. Here we have a haggard woman, prematurely aged, tired of giving. You don't know what it is to be tired. So again, playing upon obligation, solidarity, and no small amount of guilt. This is a very interesting poster as well from the 1926 campaign, where you have the huddled masses of Eastern European Jews, quite miserable, and then you have a judge and a jury, and the jury are suited, well-dressed men, women with nicely coiffed hair, clearly very middle-class, well-to-do Americans who are going to, as it were, pass judgment upon whether or not the masses of Eastern European Jews will live or die. So again, obligation and guilt, to the point that one poster points out that miserable, miserated Jews in Eastern Europe are committing suicide out of poverty, and they can't be accepted even in a Jewish cemetery. So, the question is, our people must live and will live. So clearly the sense of obligation is something deep-seated, and it goes far back, more in time than that. It goes back hundreds and hundreds of years in Jewish history, but I'll just stick with the 20th century for now. The fact is that solidarity helps explain why during World War II, membership in Zionist organizations in the United States grew as much as it did. The fact is that Zionism was not really a mass movement throughout much of the interwar period, but membership skyrocketed from 100,000 to almost 200,000 to a million, or just under a million in 1948, with about a third of American Jewish adults belonging to one kind of Zionist organization or another. That's quite significant. So what I want to talk about are the kinds of emotions that were present during the fundraising campaigns and the struggle of Israel for survival in 1948. The first thing I want to talk about are feelings of solidarity and pride. I begin with a young man whose words were reproduced in one of the Jewish newspapers. I think it was the Boston Jewish newspaper. This was a student at the University of Chicago who says, this is May of 1948, "When I saw the flag of Israel rise in the air, I felt the crowd melt in a maze of collective emotions. We were as one." And that sense of unity and of solidarity was, of course, ubiquitous. The United Jewish Appeal played upon that in its 1948 campaign, quite a bit larger. The $250 million goal didn't raise that much, but still raised quite a bit, larger than in previous years, although all of these campaigns were quite large. The idea being that the money would be divided between the United Palestine Appeal, some money going to help settle really Holocaust refugees in Palestine, the Joint Distribution Committee to work with Jews in Europe, and then much smaller amounts going to help settle Jews in North America. The fact is that from the beginning, the UJA campaign was aimed really primarily at the notion of settling displaced persons, that is Jewish refugees, who were in Eastern Europe in Palestine. For a whole variety of reasons, the United States of America was not to be a primary destination. And the emotional energy and the sense of excitement and dynamism, but also desperation that characterized American Jews during this time can be really divined through this rather humble source, a mimeographed bulletin that was put out once every couple of weeks by the United Jewish Appeal for its national volunteer and professional staff. It's really amazing to read through this source. And by the way, although I found it in an archive in Israel, it turns out that the whole thing is online. So if anybody wants the source, I'm happy to send it to you. Language that talks about the women of Hadassah as, quote, our soldiers, or that says, we are engaged in, here's a quote from the UJA bulletin, we are engaging the total Jewish community. We will flood it with advertising in newspapers, radio programs, billboards, and literature on the most extensive scale in history. Donation was presented over and over again in this newsletter as a demonstration and a response to the concern that American Jews had for their fellows in Palestine and in Europe. The publisher of the Detroit Jewish newspaper wrote, "Are you feeling confused, disturbed, emotionally exhausted by events in Palestine? Then donate, but only donate to the United Jewish Appeal." So playing upon these feelings of consternation. The concern that American Jews felt was channeled and expressed by important figures in the United Jewish Appeal hierarchy. Henry Morgenthau, who was the chair of the UJA, former Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, Herbert Lehman, who former governor of the state of New York, and then most important of all, Golda Meyerson. Now I'm going to call her Golda Meyerson because that was her name. She did not like the name Meir. She was forced to take that name when she became foreign minister in the 1950s, but her name was Meyerson, so that's the name I'm going to use. Golda Meyerson and these two men formed quite a team, and in the beginning of 1948, they spoke via telephone hookup to hundreds of UJA activists throughout the United States. Lehman warned that Israel, or not Israel at that time, but what would become a Jewish state, faced, quote, utter destruction. Meyerson spoke of an unequal war between the armed Arab states and Palestine's community. And she said, and I'm quoting, "We must ask Jews the world over to do for us what America has done for England during the Second World War." And within a couple of months, $30 million had come in. Now, the genius behind this whole campaign was this man, and it's very hard to find a picture of him. People in American Jewish history know this man, but he's certainly not a household name. Henry Montor, who was the vice chair of the UJA and an incredibly talented, successful, and rather ruthless fundraiser. And he was a master at conveying emotional appeals to people, but also at tactics of shaming people who are tagged to donate, who are asked to donate, and who don't. So whether it was country club speeches where you get a bunch of people into a room and basically no one leaves until they have doubled or tripled their pledges from previous years, Montor was really a master at getting people to donate. Now, it's hard to quantify exactly who gave what kind of sums of money, but I've read through the literature, and what I see is that gifts ranged, from $100 to $75,000. So it's obviously an enormous range. But what I've seen over and over again was a frenzy, a kind of controlled frenzy of giving, where gifts would increase 2, 3, even 5-fold from 1947 to 1948. And remember that per capita income in the US at this time was about $1,500 per year. So for a Jew to give $300 even, or $200 was quite substantial. And when you see in city after city in the records, gifts far beyond that, there's something going on. There is something that goes beyond merely the kind of charitable instincts or charitable feelings Jews would have had in previous times. And we can get some qualitative, if not quantitative, insight by looking at the correspondence of the Jewish Foundation Fund, Keren HaYesod, the fundraising arm of the Jewish Agency for Palestine. So in 1948, Keren HaYesod published pamphlets like this, and this was a booklet about Jerusalem, which actually is That's actually a view of the old city in the background through a concrete wall. Looking through the files in the Central Zionist Archive, I found hundreds and hundreds of letters from ordinary Jews enclosing literally $1. They'll give a donation of $1. Educators eager for material so they can prepare curricula on Palestine. People asking for calendars, photographs, and sometimes it became quite funny. There was one Zionist from Long Island who was not only a devoted supporter of Israel, he was also an avid gardener, and evidently he took 5 pounds of Palestinian soil from an exhibit on Palestine at Radio City Music Hall, and he wouldn't pay Karen Hayesod for the soil, and the correspondence there was rather humorous. So what made all of this work? What was it that appealed to American Jews feeling solidarity with what would become the state of Israel? Well, it wasn't entirely Golda Meyerson. There were other reasons, but I think she had a special role because she had 2 functions. On the one hand, she was a senior government official. She was the head of the political department, or the proto-foreign ministry, of what would be the state of Israel, that is the Jewish agency, a government, but she was also an American. And she spoke in the flat northern Midwestern tones of her native Milwaukee. When she spoke in Miami in February of 1948, and she said, you know, Miami reminds me of Tel Aviv, except here you don't hear shooting day and night. This is your war too, but we do not ask you to guard the convoy. If there's any blood to be spilled, let it be ours. But remember, how long the blood is shed will depend on you. So solidarity and just a tinge of guilt, which we'll talk about more later. The sense of belonging to a greater cause is epitomized by this poster, a fundraising poster from, you can see it's the United Nations partition resolution boundaries here in this poster. And here we see a man who looks like Paul Newman, but he isn't. This is about 10 years before Leon Uris's novel comes out, and about then 12, 13 years before the movie comes out. But our land, worth building, worth fighting for, the notion being that he will do the fighting, but we have to support it as well. So the sense of obligation, a partnership, admittedly an unequal one. Now, through all of these expressions of solidarity with Israel, though, there's also the potential for charges of dual loyalty. And one thing that goes back to World War I and throughout the interwar period is the constant professing by American Zionists that the values of Zionism are equivalent to, and in fact identical with, the values of American democracy, the values of frontier spirit, simplicity, purity, and so on, pioneered by Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, but repeated by many, many figures as well. It helped American Zionists in 1948 and American Jews in general that the liberal American establishment, embodied in newspapers like the Washington Post, magazines like, well, progressive magazines like The Nation or The New Republic, presented Israel as a bastion of civic virtue and American progressivism. And we see here in a poster from 1935, a kind of vicarious halutziut, where pioneers are, they symbolize just a kind of a purity, which is in some ways reminiscent of an idealized American prairie, but in some ways something quite new and exciting. Now, one thing that I find very interesting about the emotional, whether we want to call it an informal emotional community, or attempts from people like Golda Meyerson on down to create a kind of controlled emotional support for Israel, is that the American Jewish public sphere in 1948 was not entirely Zionist. There were still non-Zionist voices to be heard. And the Jewish press gave voice to them. So for example, a veteran columnist for the Cincinnati Post named Alfred Segal wrote from time to time in the Jewish press expressing discomfort with the idea of partition and supporting maybe a United Nations trusteeship, which the Truman administration toyed with in the winter of 1948. San Francisco in particular had a long tradition of anti-Zionism because of classical Reform Judaism, which was a bit slow to get rid of its anti-nationalistic and cosmopolitan bent. So here we see Lloyd Dinkelspiel, heavily involved in Stanford University, who also wrote for the Jewish press and expressed anti-Zionist views. Nonetheless, the Jewish press at the time was quite adamant in its support for Zionism. And in fact, one opinion writer for the Detroit Jewish paper wrote that Segal's columns, quote, "make me sick." So it is pretty clear that's where the majority view was. So an image of an American Israel, an Israel with which one can feel solidarity as a Jew, but also as an American. But I also want to mention that along with those feelings of solidarity, the desire to help the Jewish fighter who looks like, Ari Ben Canaan, there's also a sense of masculine pride on the part of American Jews, some of whom did volunteer, only about 1,300, but they were very popular and supported in their communities in the Machal units, the volunteer units, in 1948. So here we have a song that just seems to have cropped up spontaneously in 1948. I've been talking to many people and I've been searching on the internet for different versions of this song. It has different lyrics. They're all humorous lyrics. And it's sung to the tune of the Song of the Vagabonds from
Burgundy's spies have betrayed you.
From the Vagabond
At this very
King.
moment he is at your gates.
Hear the melody.
Sons of toil and danger, will you serve a stranger and bow down to Burgundy? Sons of shame and sorrow, will you cheer tomorrow for the crown of Burgundy? Oh.
I don't think this is a coincidence. That is, we have a song with humorous lyrics, "Oh, you sons of Moses with your crooked Moses, fight, fight, fight for Palestine," and the verses going down, they're all kind of self-deprecating, but I think it also expresses a great deal of masculine pride of going to fight for Palestine, and a melody that is from a song that is all about noble men fighting on behalf of Burgundy. So solidarity, yes. Pride, yes, but also a sense of direct involvement in the struggle for Palestine. Now, solidarity with Israel then can be associated with anger against those who wish Israel harm. And something I found surprising in my research is just how vocal and how militant the American Jewish press was in its criticism of the United States government, of the British government. And really quite shocking in the extent to which they would say things like, well, comparing the British government with saying that it's worse than the Arabs, or saying that that the British are worse than the Nazis. I mean, I've seen this sort of thing in the American Jewish press in 1948. This is one quotation: "The hurt is too deep, the wound is too painful, the insult too heavy, the betrayal too unbelievable." This is about when the United States was not quite certain if it was going to continue to support partition in the winter of 1948. What's surprising to me is that after World War I, there had been enormous gratitude towards the British government and towards the American government for supporting the Balfour Declaration. There's no gratitude in the American Jewish press in 1948. There's a sense of, in the wake of the Holocaust, that what is coming to the Jews is theirs by right. And there is a great deal of anger expressed by the likes of Nathan Ziprin of Detroit, and then this gentleman, Boris Smolar, who was a very popular Jewish journalist, wrote for a number of Jewish newspapers and was an interesting person, and expressed a great deal of anger at the time. One of the strangest things, though, I came across in my research is that I would have expected very high levels of fear for the Jewish state's survival. In the winter of 1948, Jerusalem is under siege. The roads are largely controlled by Palestinian guerrilla forces. And in May of 1948 to June, the war does not go well for Israel at first. And what really surprised me was the extent to which the American Jewish press projects confidence. And the question here is, were these authentic and sincere expressions of confidence, or was it some kind of emotional manipulation? Here's a picture of the United Nations at Lake Success. The fact is that it was very important to American Zionist lobbying to convince the United Nations and the United States government that there would not be a bloodbath in Palestine should a Jewish state be created, that in fact, the Arab states would not invade, that in fact, if there were a war, Israel could easily take care of any combination of forces that might come their way. And here I face a real conundrum, which is that the collective memory of the 1948 war from the 1950s onward clearly is one of an Israeli David, small, poorly armed, versus an Arab Goliath, well-armed, multiple Arab states. But the Jewish press in 1948 says nothing of that sort. It is quite detailed in its assessment of the weaknesses of the Arab armies, the admitted strength of the Jordanian Arab Legion, the strength of the Haganah, its morale, even getting the numbers of the number of men who could be mobilized into the Haganah correct according to the most recent archive-based historical analyses. So how do we read this? Because actually what American Jews are writing in 1948, 47, 48, is, from our perspective today, using archive-based history, is true. So was this a genuine expression of confidence, or was it an attempt to raise morale? Was it an attempt to assuage fears that there would be a bloodbath in Palestine in the case of partition? It's hard to know. Little things, not so little things. The partition resolution of 1947 was going to leave Jerusalem as an internationalized city. And the American Jewish press writes quite calmly about it in early 1948. Yes, Jerusalem won't be part of the Jewish state, but it'll be fine anyway. But then, as Israel conquers Western Jerusalem during the fighting in 1948, and as it becomes clear that Jerusalem, at least part of Jerusalem, will be an integral part of Israel, the American Jewish press then says, I'm quoting, Israel without Jerusalem is like New England without Boston. So again, it seems to be a direct result of changes on the ground, as opposed to simply just an outpouring of uncomplicated emotion. So does this mean that American Jews don't express fear in 1948? Yes, they do, but they express fear that I hadn't expected to find. The American Jewish press is largely sympathetic with labor Zionism, not necessarily because of sympathies with socialism or social democracy, but the value of labor Zionism as settling the land, as embodying a pioneer spirit. This was kind of a softened image of labor Zionism that was extremely appealing in interwar America. And the real enemy in the newspapers I've looked at throughout the United States, about 10, 12 newspapers, was the Irgun, the right-wing militia associated with revisionist Zionism. It was the civil conflict in Palestine that infuriated writers for these newspapers who talked to the Irgun members as terrorists and as threatening to destroy the country before it's born. There was also a great deal of fear expressed in 1948 in the Jewish press for Jews in the Arab world. Boris Smolar writes, whose needs at the moment are greater, the Jews in Arab lands or those of the DPs in Europe? There's a great deal of concern about the fate of Jews in the Arab world. And then last but not least, real concern about anti-Semitism in the United States, which was the object of a multi-issue series of stories in the New Republic. And the Jewish press is quite explicit about this, that we're very worried about anti-Semitism in the United States, and that Israel will help American Jews fight anti-Semitism. It will take in European Jews who are now in Europe, and if they were to come to the United States, that could be problematic, but also that by displaying courage and pride and resolve, Israel will demonstrate to the world that Jews are not cowards, that they are not people without honor. The American Jewish press is quite explicit about this, that Israel will serve American Jewish interests. So this is not some kind of emotional direction coming from Israel. This is something coming from within the United States. Another thing that I found that was quite surprising was that in the Jewish press, I thought they wouldn't really talk much about the Palestinian refugee issue, but they did, and with an amazing level of sympathy early in the war. So you find in sort of May, June of 1948, the American Jewish press routinely writes that any Palestinian refugees should be allowed back, that their land should not be taken, that the Haganah is protecting Palestinian lands. Even that IDF soldiers are farming the lands for the Palestinians and will give them the produce when they return. This language is not that different from what Golda Meyerson herself and Moshe Chertok, the first foreign minister of the state of Israel, were actually saying at the time. So again, there is some information or direction coming from above. The American Jewish press emphasized that the real problem was not the Palestinians who wished Israel no ill, but rather Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian leader, who here we see a cartoon from the Jewish press. The Mufti is actually putting a rifle in between a seated Arab and a Jew, and he is the true disturber of the peace. Now, in real life, we know, based on archival knowledge, I'm just mentioning here's a Haganah assessment of Palestinian flight from June of 1948, that in fact Palestinians fled primarily because of Jewish military action. That did not make it into Israeli pronunciations at the time. It did not make it into the American Jewish press. But what does happen is that people like Sharet, or the future mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, or the skilled diplomat Abba begin to change the way that the Palestinian issue is talked about in July, August of 1948, from a position of sympathy to one of indifference, that these refugees shouldn't have left, but they did, and they're not coming back. And the American Jewish press begins to follow suit with more and more articles saying, this is a fait accompli, the refugees are gone. But what I didn't expect to find is there is still a good deal of sympathy and generosity in opinion pieces in Jewish papers in Boston, Detroit, San Francisco, Philadelphia, and so on, saying even in the fall of 1948, after the Israeli government has determined that the refugees won't come back, that they should be allowed to return. So it's a complicated story where the press in general follows an Israeli line, but not completely. Henrietta Zold, Judith Epstein, and Rose Halpern, presidents of Hadassah in the 1930s and 1940s, were famous for being in general more dovish than their male counterparts in the Zionist movement. But it's actually in April of 1948 that a Hadassah publication says, and this is the first time I found it in the American Jewish publications of the time, that Palestinian refugees were basically told to leave their homes, as opposed to simply fleeing in panic, which is what you usually found in the Jewish press at the time. So, and that argument became much more common as time went by. So what I find interesting then is an expression of sympathy, compassion, but there's this element of indifference or even callousness that grows over time. The final point I want to make is about the power of guilt, which clearly is very powerful in the United Jewish Appeal campaigns of 1948. It was called the Destiny Campaign. This is a campaign to decide the destiny of an entire people. You cannot bring back last year's dead. You cannot give on last year's basis. Give so that they might live. It's over and over again. If you do not give, they will die. This is an extremely graphic example. This is a fundraising pamphlet from April of 1948. Jewish blood flows again. Fighting blood, the blood of heroes, freedom blood, and in the form of a telegram, you are safe, your future is secure, but what if the Jewish defenders are wiped out? What then, oh America, give, give, give. So the message is, I think, fairly clear. The same graphic style was used in this poster here. Hurry, this year it's an emergency. And I wanted to share with you one particular remarkable line from the Boston Combined Jewish Appeal director on the eve of the new year in 1948, when he says that we, the Jewish communities of America, have the fate of European Jewry in our hands. We will decide whether the remnants of our people in Europe shall continue their miserable existence or whether they shall be liberated and given the chance for a new life in the new state of Israel. Who shall live and who shall die in the high holiday liturgy That's the province of God. But here it is now the obligation of human beings. So we see a very heavy dose of, yes, compassion, solidarity, and no small amount of guilt. In this poster from 1947, we saw an inkling of this, where a suited American hand, well-manicured suit, dress shirt, it hands a trowel to a Holocaust survivor in Palestine with a tattooed arm and a clenched hand, but, well, an unclenched hand, ready to take the trowel. What really struck me over and over again in the fundraising literature in 1947 and 48 is that Israel rarely appears as something that is other than a receptacle for Holocaust survivors. We see it, we just saw it in the Jewish Blood Flows Again pamphlet, but more often than that, the purpose of Israel is to engage in what Golda Meyerson called the greatest resettlement project in history. This was demonstrated again and again in the imagery, in the posters of the time. The campaign called Dollars for Survival in 1948 tells Jews that if you give, this is almost all of the emphasis in these ads is about settling Holocaust survivors or DPs in Palestine. And this one says that if you give $10,000, it will construct 2 3-room houses for refugees. Quote, they will build the houses themselves. Now, will they really build the houses themselves? Refugees from Eastern Europe are going to build the houses themselves. But it says they will build the new nation. Now I'm glad he was born. The children born in the DP camps will have a life. Now, time is running short, and so I don't know if I have time to show a very brief segment from a UJA film, and I have to get my, so Laura, Michael, you can tell me if I can have 4 minutes or if I should stop right now.
Go ahead, yes.
So I'm going to show you a part of really a remarkable film. The man who directed it was actually the editor of M, Fritz Lang's film Ed. He was a German-Jewish editor who then wound up in Los Angeles during World War II and made films for the UJA and for the Histadrut. And I'm going to play you just the last.
Cold chills them at night. Cold chills them at night. This woman.
So I should just mention, this is about refugees who are in tent cities with inadequate housing and medical care and food and so forth in the new state of Israel.
Has little chance to recover. The camp authorities are fighting a desperate battle to prevent disaster. Clinics have been set up, but the sick must wait hours to see a doctor. You can't explain to a sick child why this must be. The adults know only too well what waiting means. They've been waiting for long, almost unending years. But the children, the 11,000 children in the camps, can't understand. This baby never heard of the United Jewish Appeal, of unfilled quotas, unpaid pledges. All she knows is the pain that is always with her. The nurses, the doctors do their best, but their best is not enough. Where life should be blossoming, death is an all too frequent visitor. There are tears, the women gather, and then go back to waiting. Sickness and death are always around the corner for these children condemned to live in filthy tents. Only the flies thrive amid the filth and the debris. They feed on children and the children's food with even-handed impartiality. If you need water to wash, to cook, it's available a half-mile away. If you have need for sanitary facilities, you trudge a quarter of a mile in the blazing sun to reach a primitive outhouse. When you want to eat, you stand in line. They thought they were through standing in line when they left the DP camps. Here they must line up and wait their turn to get their meals. It's not pleasant to stand under a broiling sun for hours. It's not going to be any better when the rainy season comes. The days stretch into weeks, the weeks into months. Disappointment grows into despair, despair into bitterness, bitterness into anger at the officials. Who is to blame? Did you have a share in putting these people into the tents, into these lines? Are we responsible for keeping them there for 3 and 4 and 5 months? They're not moving out. Do you know why? It's very simple. There is no money to give them a home. Who's to blame for this crisis? Perhaps the agencies of the United Jewish Appeal haven't done enough. Perhaps it's too much for them to handle. Or does the fault lie with American Jewry? Have we done enough? What shall we tell them? These tens of thousands who are living in hell on the very soil of the promised land. What shall we tell them when they ask for a home, for 4 walls they can call their own, for a ceiling overhead, a floor underfoot? What shall we tell them when they say, is it for this we came from the DP camps? Is it for this we slipped across hostile borders? Is it for this we traveled halfway around the world? There's only one thing we can tell them. We can tell them, we must tell them, that they did not come in vain, that there will be a home for them in the homeland. The people of Israel have already told them so. The people of Israel have adopted an austerity standard of life to share whatever they have with the newcomers. What sacrifice are we prepared to make? This crisis cannot be minimized. We must act now, today. Cash is the only thing that'll get them out of these camps. Cash is the only thing that will give them a new home. Cash for the United Jewish Appeal will fulfill our promise that they shall not be homeless again.
So I think that's a good way to stop, and for me just to conclude with the observation that obviously there is direction coming from different sources, whether it's the Israeli government, whether it is the top brass, the people who design the UJA fundraising campaigns, the people who make films like this. But at the end of the day, the people who opened their wallets and gave them money, clearly these messages spoke to them. And I think we need to really think through that question of how the emotional message affected the individuals and why they came forth as generously as they did. Otherwise, we really won't get to the bottom of the emotional outpouring of support for Israel in 1948. So with that, I'll stop, and I very much look forward to your questions. I'm sorry if I ran 5 minutes over. So let me stop sharing my screen. And now I'm just seeing a, I don't know what I should be seeing actually. I see Hollywood Squares.
Okay, but I think the audience still sees you.
Okay,
thank you so much, Derek. I think, as always, a very profound, learned, balanced lecture with a lot of great footage and pictures as well. I don't want to take too much time as the questions come in. Let me just ask, and I think we'll take 15 to 20 minutes to answer the questions. Let me just start with one question, which of course was kind of implicit in your last slides, and that's the relationship between the Holocaust and American Jewry and Israel and the DP camps, which came up. How would you say, what role played kind of a bad conscience that maybe American Jews didn't do or couldn't have done enough to save European Jews, and that somehow fueled the help to build Israel and the real amazing rise of numbers of the support of Zionism in the 1940s?
I'm sure it's it's essential and it hangs on. I'll just give an example of, I'm not going to open up my screen again, but there's a poster from 1957. So now we're talking about a different crisis, the crisis of 1956 in Hungary. And there's a poster of, you know, poorly shod, poorly clothed Central European Jews. And the caption says, "This time we can save them." So this, you know, so clearly there is a bad conscience. There's a feeling of guilt about that as well. And it's something that is, again, it's implicit in this notion that you have the obligation to do for the refugees what they can't do for themselves. There was also a film that I wish I could show it, but it's only, you can get it from the Holocaust Museum on short-term loan, and then the link disappears. It's a film called Shadows of Hate from 1947, where it says, you know, you are living in comfort, you're eating ice cream, you are going to amusement parks, and, you know, then there's the images of what's not just the images of the DP camps, to answer your question, it's also, they replay the whole history of Nazism and the Holocaust. Yeah. This is what was happening. And then Eisenhower comes on. They got Eisenhower to actually make a cameo appearance. And then basically he's saying implicitly, you American Jews are doing something truly American by supporting the United Jewish Appeal. So I think all of these things are coming together.
Thank you, Derek. So let me start with the question from Harold Road, who says, what about the Jews in the US who bought and packaged weapons to send to Israel?
Well, it's a smaller community. I mean, that's the other interesting thing, is that, you know, the UJA scores hundreds of thousands of donations. There is a whole other story in 1948. I mentioned the Machal, the volunteers, that's about 1,200. And then there's the gun runners. And this is a story that's kind of shrouded in romance and exaggeration, but it really did happen. There was the legal fundraising campaign to purchase weapons that raised about $50–60 million that went to buy weapons from Czechoslovakia, Italy, France, the United Kingdom. Then there was a much smaller kind of illegal gun running campaign. It didn't really involve sending guns to Palestine. It involved sending ammunition and machinery for the manufacture of ammunition, which was actually extremely important, because one of the reasons Israel won the war, although the Arab states were better armed at first, Israel had the ability to repair its weapons, and they didn't run out of bullets. So that really did happen, and the stuff was sent over illegally through something called the Sonenshine Institute, connected with the Baltimore industrialist Rudolf Sonenshine. So this really did happen, but it was sub rosa, whereas what I'm talking about now was completely open. I mean, screamed at you in the Jewish press and in the general press as well.
Thank you. A question from a recent graduate from AU, Caitlin Conklin, who asks about if you could say something on the support from Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Americans in comparison, also maybe from which, you know, geographical differences. She asked about northern states compared to those in southern or western states.
Yeah, I mean, for that, it's a great question. And for that, I would have to do a level of social historical research that would be hard within the framework of an article. But what surprised me, frankly, was the relative uniformity, because I looked at publications from Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Detroit, New York, I mean, Miami. So we're looking at lots of different places. And I don't see that much difference. The one major difference I saw was San Francisco, because of the strength of Reform Judaism and a certain kind of Reform Judaism in San Francisco. But other than that, I was taken aback, actually. Now, it's also the question of, you know, who's publishing these newspapers. They tend to be middle-aged men of means, merchants, people in business, born in Eastern Europe, who came to the United States in the early 20th century, and although they still knew Yiddish, they were very Americanized. And there was a certain homogeneity to them. So I haven't seen that much difference. One thing that I did see in the references to the rabbis, for example, is the extent to which Orthodox rabbis, these are modern Orthodox rabbis, are also expressing support in 1940, in 1948, and a lot of conservative rabbis.
Thanks. And maybe connected to this, Pamela Walker asks how much this is a uniquely American response compared to Jews in other states.
Well, I think it's certainly unique in kind. When you think about it after World War II, after the destruction of European Jewry and the immiseration of those Jews who are left. I mean, what's really left, and what I haven't done yet, is the same kind of research, say, for Jews in the United Kingdom and France. But little I've done is, yes, obviously there's solidarity. It would be very interesting to compare the element of guilt as perhaps being present in the United States more than, say, in France, where Jews suffered under Nazi occupation and so many French Jews died, 70,000 died. 1/4 of French Jewry died in the Holocaust. So I think we'd find a different, emotional mix in France than in the United States. And then of course in quantity, there's nothing that can compare, because it was the United States that really shouldered this financial burden in 1948. I think of the $78 million raised for arms purchase in 1948, 62 million or 63 million came from the United States.
Yes, which of course was the only place that had the means.
That had the money, yeah.
To do that. Jonathan Band asks about if there was concern about the socialism or labor Zionism and a possible alignment with the USSR.
That's really interesting. And again, it's something that I didn't find, and here I'm relying on, I remember years ago wasn't R.A. Gordon wrote a great article called Anu Banu Artsa about how labor Zionism sort of gets Americanized. And then Mark Rader wrote a very important book about this about 20 years ago, that again, the harder edges of socialist Zionism get smoothed down, and the labor Zionism that's represented to the American Jewish public is softer. What I found also interesting is an emphasis on the future Jewish state, or the state of Israel, as America's youngest sibling. That message, whether it's fabricated, whether it's sincere, is consistent, to the point that the American Jewish press and pro-Israel press took huge pride in the fall of 1948 that Israel was going to have a constitution. And they even said, there was a headline, it will not be a social democratic state. Israeli constitution forthcoming will be a liberal republic, not social democratic state, and it will have a Bill of Rights. And they go on and on and on. And then there's no constitution.
Well, we're still waiting for that.
We're still waiting. And what I love here is it just disappeared. The Jewish press is writing about it week after week after week, and then poof, it's gone. Mm-hmm. Because there's a desire not to criticize the country. But I think that Israel is then very much presented in an American, progressive, liberal American kind of framework.
Interesting. Lisa Leff from the United States Holocaust Museum and our former dean asks if there was any similar mobilization among American Jews to open the US to the Jewish DPs.
No, not that I know of. There's probably people in the audience who know more about this than I do. But my understanding is that the American Jewish sort of Zionist movement and the American Jewish organization elite face a challenge, which is that there is a Truman directive on immigration that will allow 400,000 DPs to come to the United States, but the emphasis will be on those with agricultural labor background or skills. And so how many Jews are going to get in under that framework? And of course, some Jews do come to the United States after 1945. But what I found overwhelmingly, whether it's the newspapers or the fundraising literature, both published and archival, is that this is all about getting DPs to Palestine. And again, if you look at the budget, the North American settlement gets, I think, 3%, of total UJA receipts. And that's a conscious decision. And there's even a decision made in the 48 campaign that I think it's 62% or something of all the proceeds will go to the Palestine appeal. And then there'll be some to the JDC to help the Jews who are still in Europe for the time being, and then this tiny fraction for settlement in North America. So it's clearly at the bottom of the list, and for political reasons. I mean, there's political realities that the American Jews are dealing with after 1945.
Thanks. Interesting question by Shai Haskani. Also, did you find discussion of American Zionists who came out against Zionist propaganda in America or otherwise were disenchanted with Israel in the immediate aftermath of 1948?
Well, I wouldn't find it here, that's for sure. That is, the sources I'm looking at are by definition establishment publications. that are supportive of Israel. To find that kind of public, that kind of writing, you'd have to look elsewhere. I know that I had a student, actually, an undergraduate at Harvard, who went through sort of the underground radical leftist press from but it's already in the 1960s when you get, Jews who are writing about Israel in this vein, and then the trouble that they make for the American Jewish establishment. So, Shai, I appreciate your question coming from your own important work on soldiers in the field in 1948 and their own experiences. But I certainly would not find that kind of material in the sources that I've been looking at, nor have I found it in the archival sources. But on the other hand, I was looking at the archives of the fundraising agencies and of the government agencies dealing with the fundraising agencies. The only thing I did find that might interest you, Shai, is in Latin America, in Mexico, there were anti-Zionist Jews sympathetic with the ACJ, the American Council on Judaism, and they basically get into fights, fist fights with Zionists in Mexico City. And letters are written to the UJA saying, these anti-Zionists are making us miserable. So yeah, that's the one piece of evidence I found.
Now, few specific questions, if you don't mind. Ed Sondegas, did NBC's Eternal Light play a role in support for Israel?
Aha, I love that question because I've been watching or listening to, it became a TV show later, I've been listening to old episodes of the Eternal Light. Something that really strikes me as odd, the Eternal Light had very few episodes about Zionism and Israel. It was on for decades and they had hundreds and hundreds of episodes. Harvard has all of them because that's Harvard's library. They buy everything. There were a few, but they tended to deal with Israel in a kind of abstract notion connected with prophetic ideals of justice. So you'd have something like the prophet Isaiah is walking through the streets of Israel, things like that. It was very disembodied from the reality. And I read through the synopses of, I think the entire run of the Eternal Light. I saw there was one about Herzl that presented him as a kind of a wonder-working, magical figure who was 6'5" and who could play the accordion. And he played Hava Nagila, which is interesting because it hadn't been written yet. But I did not find episodes that dealt with it concretely. And I think that tells you something about the Eternal Light and the way it presented history.
Okay.
I think it did more for American Jewish history.
Interesting. Michael Kurtzig asked, could you discuss the role of Eddie Jacobson in the UN vote?
I probably don't know anything more about that than what I've read in the secondary literature. These people who were close to Truman, who had his ear, and then the question is, it's overdetermined that you have this circle of advisors, Jacobson and others. If you take one out of the equation, does Truman, decide against the support for partition? And I don't know. I know that John Judis's book, Genesis, has taken a lot of criticism, but I actually think that in some ways the book is helpful when he talks about this constellation of people lobbying Truman, all through 1947 and 1948. So I can't isolate Eddie Jacobson, unfortunately.
Right. Mandy Rabinovitz asked, how would you explain the sharp decline in the donations at 1949, 1950, which led to the establishment of the bond drive?
Yeah, the bond drive. That's a whole other interesting question, which in a way, it demonstrates my point from the other end, which is that these levels of emotional arousal and mobilization can't be sustained. That in the wake of 1945, there is an outpouring of concern, fear, guilt, you name the emotion bundle. And it lasts until the state is established. And then in 1949, there's another $250 million campaign that falls way short. People are exhausted. I think they're tapped out, for one thing. They've given a lot for the last 3 years, and they're just exhausted. And as I recall, in '56, now Golda Meir, was sent back to the US to work her magic, and it didn't work this time. American Jews were less worried about Israel's future in 1956 than they were in 1948. But the Israel bond drive was successful, but it had a very different set of propositions. It wasn't philanthropy, it was an investment.
There are many more good questions, and I apologize I cannot take all, but let me take one more because this is kind of a question that, of course, wraps it up in a way. Basil Golding asked, to what extent did US Jewish money help Israel survive?
The answer is without the money, there wouldn't have been an Israel. I think it's categorical. If the money hadn't been there, Israel could not have bought weapons. In 1948, Israel had no patron state. Revolutionary movements, anti-colonial movements usually have a patron state that gives them things. The Soviet Union or China for liberation movements in the second half of the 20th century. Israel bought everything on the open market, and they had to have the money. So, you know, I mean, the Algerians did this a little bit with the Jeanson network that smuggled money into Algeria to buy weaponry and so forth. But with Israel, it was entirely dependent upon the money. So, you know, I can be a little uncertain about some things, but on that one, I'm absolutely certain that it was completely determinative.
Thank you, Derek. I should say some of the comments said fantastic, and another person said you should, when you asked if you should play the clip, go on for much longer. So at some point, especially over Zoom, I think we cannot go on forever. So thank you also all for your questions. And again, Helen and Dan, thank you so much for making this possible. But mainly, of course, thank you to you, Derek. I know you would have loved to come to us, and we will bring you back again. I remember you were one of the very first speakers you had here when I arrived 7 years ago. And I think for those of you who weren't able to watch it, we will make the recording available. And for all of you who are still on, please check out our programs to come. We have a lot of interesting programs coming up in October, among them a tribute to the late Yitzhak Rabin, 25 years after his assassination, with his daughter, Dalia Rabin, with his close associate, Itamar Rabinovich, with Dennis Ross. And we have many other fascinating events coming up, also our series on anti-Semitism. So stay tuned, and for all of you, Shana Tova, and hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
And thank you again, Michael, and thank you for making this possible. Shana Tova, Chatima Tova to everyone.